Before we get to the conversation that he and I are going to have, I want to set some context and put this in perspective in terms of why you should care and why we are here today. Why we're here today is really because there's a massive opportunity in front of us. Over the next 3 years, there's going to be $50 billion that's going to be spent in advertising on mobile apps within gaming. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. $50 billion. That's a huge opportunity, and it's every publisher who's here, every publisher who's building a gaming app has the opportunity to tap into that. And we're going to spend some time today talking about how do you do that, how do you get there. There are a few key elements that go into that, but I want to start with ad formats and why ad formats are an important part of how you should be thinking about this. I'm going to introduce the classic maturity curve, which many of you have probably seen versions of before. The way I think about this is the vertical axis here is really performance, and performance is measured by the scale of spend, how much demand is out there, how many advertisers are buying this format, and adoption is the horizontal axis, is measured by how many apps are out there that use this format. And the 320 by 50 banner, everybody's favorite ad format, is really out there at the top. It's been around for a long time. It's the one that we see the most scale on. But interstitials and rewarded video, I think, are two important formats which have, in the last 3 years, really risen through that maturity curve, have become important parts of what games use, of what gaming publishers use for monetization. They fit in well within the gaming experience with natural breakpoints and integration with the in-app economy and with IAP and synergies across that ecosystem. So they're definitely important. And at the low end of that spectrum are really emerging formats. 360 video is one example. There are going to be more this year, hopefully, with AR becoming a thing and other innovations coming to the fore. But the one that stands out for us as we look across the ecosystem is native. Native has been an up-and-coming format for a while, has been talked about for a while. It's an integral way to think about making the consumer experience seamless. And as you think about capitalizing on that 50 billion opportunity, making sure that your ads are seamlessly welded into your consumer experience is a really important thing to consider. And as you think about that, you need to start thinking early. Where can you introduce ads, and how can native be a way in which you can introduce ads in a seamless way into your experience? When we have the conversation with Mike, we're going to spend some more time discussing this, and they have actually done a really good job of integrating native ads into their game experience. The second aspect that feeds into revenue here, which is also important, obviously, is the CPMs. This chart is to scale. There's obviously a pretty substantial variation in CPMs. Why are we talking about formats? Why is all of this important? It's important because you need to think about ad revenue and ad monetization as a portfolio. You need to think about what's the mix of formats you want to use in your game. What's the mix of revenue from different formats that you expect to drive? How does that work into your consumer experience? And this is not just for the next app you're building, but you need to think about this for the next set of apps that you're building over the next year. And that's the right way to think about how do you drive sustainable revenue. We're going to spend some more time talking about that. But coming back to what are the ingredients for success, as you think about the opportunity that's out there, it's important to start early. And by early, I mean thinking about ads woven into the gameplay experience. Think about ads as part of the product that you're building, and think about the consumer experience in that context. Define your monetization goals up front. What's the mix of ad revenue and IAP revenue that you want? How soon do you want to get there? When do you want to introduce your consumers and your customers to ads? And how does that impact the gameplay experience and the revenue experience that you want to drive? Define that early and define that at the start. And think about this as a portfolio. If you were to build a stock portfolio, you wouldn't just bet on one stock and assume that that's going to get you where you need to be. You would build a portfolio, you would hedge your risks, you would balance your risks, and you would change that over time. Apply that same concept to how you think about games, to how you think about building a sustainable revenue portfolio, and find that balance and tune that balance as you evolve your game strategy. So to reiterate, define the monetization goals up front. Start ad monetization early. Think about this as you're developing the product, not as an afterthought, not after you hit user scale, but think about it holistically right from the beginning. Think about how this weaves into the consumer experience. There was some conversation around how placements impact the consumer experience. Think about that. Also think about how you're going to make this an expectation. When you turn on the TV and you watch programming, you expect to see an ad before you start programming. It's part of our psyche. It's how we are trained. And a lot of that is important when you think about building a gameplay experience, when you think about building a gaming experience and building ads into that experience. And finally, like I said, build a portfolio. With that, I'm going to welcome Mike onto the stage. Please give him a hand. So to make this interesting and exciting, we're going to start with a quick introduction to Mike and what he does. And then we decided that we'll start with a challenging question to each other.
Thank you. So my name's Mike Evans. I'm the CMO at Sega. I've been at Sega now for an extremely long time within the space, about 11 years. But over that period of time, my role has changed dramatically from originally console through to mobile on the kind of premium side, through to kind of free-to-play mobile. I relocated to the States about 4 years ago. And as part of that, I set up the ad business there as well. We had an app which was Sonic Dash 1, and it drove a very high volume of downloads, but the monetization from in-app purchases was relatively low. So we started on a journey then at that point with our own mediation, going through from there to try and Burstly before that disappeared, to then working with MoPub amongst other mediators as well. So it's been a really good way for Sega to develop some sustainable revenue as well.
Great. I'll take your question first.
All right, so question. Okay. So the one thing that keeps, I suppose, me up at night is, you know, MoPub, it has its own demand. But also, you are the mediator as well. Mm-hmm. So my question is twofold. First of all, how do you keep yourself honest? How do you make sure that, given that you're getting the first view of that impression, you're not kind of prioritizing yourself above? And then, given that people will be working with a host of different mediators as well, how can we validate that? Is there any kind of methods that you can suggest as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that we get often. And for those of you who are not familiar with MoPub, we operate the largest leading ad monetization platform. There's a mediation solution that's part of that. There's also a marketplace, which is what Mike is referring to. So to your question, Mike, there's two parts to it. The first is we've always operated, we've been built as a publisher-first platform. And that's how we think about our product. That's how we think about the philosophy of how we run our business. The mediation and the marketplace both operate in synergy to maximize value to the publisher. So for each impression, the marketplace only wins when it beats a network on CPM, on return to you as a publisher. And if the marketplace is less competitive, the network would win the impression, right? So that's how we think about this. And from a share of voice or an impression level point of view, we have also built our platform and operate with transparency as a primary value for how we think about our product. So the publisher has complete flexibility and complete control over how you choose to prioritize your different demand sources. You can choose to not give marketplace first look, and that's your prerogative, in which case the network that you choose to give first look would win the impression. That's not the revenue maximization strategy, but if that's the path that you choose to go down, we give you that flexibility and that control.
Right.
And in terms of how you can test this and how you can validate that this actually works the way it's intended to work, like I said, you have flexibility over how you want to design your waterfall. You have the control over when you introduce marketplace competition, with which networks, at what priorities, where in the waterfall. All of that is at your discretion. And if you want to test that, you have the ability to test that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anand.
So my question to you, Mike, is you've been in gaming for over a decade. You've spent the last several years thinking about mobile, spending a lot of time building up a mobile revenue portfolio at Sega. What scares you the most about mobile monetization?
I think that there's a number of points to this, but I think right at the top is maintaining the consumer experience and balancing that with making as much money, obviously, you obviously can as well with the app itself. So, you know, the devs will spend a long, long time, and there's going to be a lot of investment in the game itself as well. So if we are not QAing the stack properly, if we're showing blank ads, if we're crashing the games, then, you know, we affect the star rating, we let the consumers down, we let the developers down as well. So for me, that's probably the biggest thing, is how do we maintain consumer experience, but then also at the same time, how do we maximize the yield of the ads itself?
Yeah, great point. And we hear the same across all the publishers that we work with, and I think the most important thing that that we think everyone needs to get right, and almost as a paradigm shift, is think about ads as part of the product that you're building, and not make it an afterthought, and weave it into the development process. Great. To set this up, I would love to hear from you. There's an important initiative that you guys embarked on, Sega Forever. Can you speak to that and give the audience and us more context?
Yeah,
Why
sure
did you go down that path, and what are you learning as you go down the journey?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the vision behind Sega Forever was to change the way the world plays, rediscovers and shares in classic game content. So Sega has a lot of IP, and so what we've done is we've taken 2 decades worth of retro gaming content. So that goes as far back as Sega's first console, which is the SG-1000, through to the Master System, the Game Gear, the Genesis, and then on to the Saturn and the Dreamcast. And what we're doing is we're bringing all of these games back to the App Store, and we are setting them free with an ad-supported model. So in essence, what we're doing is we're democratizing retro gaming. The kind of the strategy behind this falls on 3 publishing pillars. So the first is network creation. So within mobile, the network you have represents a lot of power. So what we're doing is we're releasing all the games individually, roughly every 2 weeks. There's over 1,000 titles in Sega's catalogue, and then that's first-party published as well. And then there's many, many more titles which were third-party published. So we have a great kind of variety of content to kind of pick. And by releasing them every week, we're doing a couple of things. First of all, we're building an audience. So that audience enables us to generate a very sustainable revenue stream from the ads itself. It also helps with the user acquisition. So we're able to support, as we build critical mass, the release of subsequent games as well, and drive traffic into those games from the games we've already released. And that also plays into the second pillar, which we'll talk about in a sec as well. And the third pillar behind it is the consumer insight. So, so one of the things I'm going to be able to understand is the relative strength of the IP by the download volumes behind the games itself. And then we're also running ongoing surveys on the games itself. So I understand the demographics and the psychographics of the users. And so I can use that to inform the pipeline, which we're making in the second pillar. Now, the second pillar is we're combining basically the rewarded ad model with in-app purchase. And this is kind of the network expansion phase. So we're developing games which have a very high affinity with Sega Forever. So again, the cross-promotion between the two is very, very solid. And I was really interested in areas of the App Store where brand penetration was low. So normally, if you're going to go and acquire a brand and license the brand out, you have an MG associated with that brand. And you might have to pay that MG on a kind of yearly basis as well, and there's a rev share off the back. So for us, when I was thinking about what's unique and how do we compete, I was like, we can use our brands and we don't have to pay for those brands as well. We are using third-party brands. We've done 2 games so far on this particular pillar. So the first game was Crazy Taxi Gazillionaires. The second game was released only a couple of weeks ago, was WWE Tapmania. And so the areas of the store that had low brand penetration, the first area we started with was idle games. And at the time that we started looking a year ago, there was only one, I suppose, brand in the space, Non-Stop Chuck Norris, if you count that as a brand as well. So that's been a good venture, and we're scaling that business as we go forward. But the combination of rewarded ads and that purchase monetizes from a lifetime value perspective at a much higher rate than what we're doing with the older console games on Sega Forever. And so finally, the third pillar is the top grossing games. So top grossing games are a lot riskier, the market's a lot more stagnant. So, but the first 2 layers give us a very, very sustainable revenue stream, and then also help with some of the user acquisition, so it improves the margins on what we're doing.
It's a great perspective, and ties back to some of the things that we believe is that for success, you need to define your monetization goals up front.
Yeah.
You need to think through it as a portfolio and not as individual titles and individual apps. You need to think about the entire breadth of what you're building, and if that's something that you're in that stage of the journey, it's important as a publisher to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to hit a few questions as we go through this. So I'm going to bundle all of these together and ask you these questions together. When you think about monetization, and especially ads, is it ever too early to think about introducing ads in the experience? And how do you balance when you introduce ads with what the consumer engagement is, what the consumer experience is, and how do you think about formats interplaying into all of that?
All right, there's a lot of questions there. So, is it ever too early? First and foremost, you've got to have a compelling game experience, which has got to be right for a market itself. If you don't have that, in essence, you don't have anything at all. That said, you can't divorce the monetization and the game concept as well. And you know, like the previous talk, you have to start early. So we, very, very early on, start doing kind of wireframing and prototyping on paper. And with that, what we're doing is we're looking to see how the rewarded ad loops, for example, will fit into that game itself. So we're trying to understand from the consumer experience perspective how we can create value, how potentially we can reduce some of the grind in the game for the consumers if they want to interact with the ads, how we can make, you know, some areas of the game almost like some areas of the ads almost like a mini game in itself by interacting with the ads, or trying to figure out how, you know, if a user's going to, you know, use it as a retention mechanic. So if a user is going to activate a power up and then they're going to come back, they're going to see additional revenue as a result of that as well. So in terms of other things that we look at as well, it's really important that you view your metrics of the game. So from a consumer experience perspective, you know, you want to look at metrics like the opt-in rate, you want to look at IMPDAU, so impressions to DAU. You want to understand how those consumers are interacting with those spaces. You want to make sure that we spend a lot of time as well from the consumer experience perspective, trying to make sure that your all your SDKs that sit within the apps itself don't crash the games. That's one of my worst fears. So we spend a lot of time on that. That's really, really important. If you're going to be using interstitials versus rewarded, then it's important, we found, that you merchandise that users can turn off the ads for a purchase. So within Sega games itself, anytime somebody makes a purchase, we disable ads for perpetuity. So we had a game which was Super Monkey Ball Bounce. It's a Peggle style game, and in between each level we were showing an interstitial ad. And what we found was that if we gave up some of the ad placements and that we merchandised users the fact that they could turn off an ad, then not only did we reduce the friction, help with the understanding, but we also we drove people directly from that placement through to the store itself to make a purchase, and we saw an uptick in terms of the revenue that we were doing as well. The other tip to think about is how you basically have the rewarded buttons within a game shown within the UI. So the worst thing from a consumer experience perspective is they accidentally click a button and they launch a 30-second non-skippable ad. Now, for many users, this will be all right, I don't want to wait, I'm just going to shut it down. So we're very, very consistent with the way that we, the icons that we use throughout the games, so the consumers understand that they're able to kind of turn off, so they're just about to land and start and initiate a rewarded ad itself.
Great. So on that note, with formats, I want to kind of bring up two examples that Sega is using in their games, and both of these are actually native ads. What I really like about both of these, especially the one on the top left, is that it's sort of a full screen experience which gives you more real estate on the screen and helps you drive more engagement, but at the same time you're retaining some of the functionality and the buttons, so it doesn't feel disruptive. It's not taking over the screen, and it's not as interruptive as, for example, interstitial would be. Right? Can you talk us through the philosophy of how you think about embedding native ads in your games and what's behind that?
Yeah, it's going to differ for different developers depending on the challenge and the type of game that they have and what they're making. So within Sega Forever, probably about 90% of the games are emulated games. So what we have is we have a wrapper, and then we drop the ROMs into the wrapper. The wrapper is the secret sauce behind the games, where we'll have leaderboards and controller support, etc. And then so we couldn't put ads into the game itself, which is a good thing as well for kind of preserving the experience. So we had to think very carefully about the ad integration in the wrapper. Mm-hmm. And so what you want to find is you want to find areas where you have either some dwell time, or you want to find areas where it's high frequency and lots of kind of transient traffic going through. So in the image up there on the top left is a 5-element native ad. Now, the performance we found is the larger you can get the ad, the better the performance of the ad itself. So here, the particular screen is a save screen. So you go into the pause menu and you're able to save the game itself. So we found that users were kind of frequenting this screen fairly often. The other thing that we found is that many users, in terms of the way they play the games, will soft close the game. So they close the game, it goes down to their system tray. When they come back into the game itself, the game is paused, because obviously you don't want the game running straight away. The pause screen then shows the 5-element native ad. The great thing about native kind of versus banners, and we definitely should test between the two, is that you can do a lot if you want to make them look nice and contextual, so you can change the color of the text and the fonts as well. My biggest request from MoPub, by the way, is to be able to kind of fail over between between native and between banners as well, because the only challenge we've had with native so far is on the fill. You know, native's great, we see higher CPMs, but we're having to constantly try and find new partners to fill what we're doing. So the 4-element native, which you see at the base of the screen on the right-hand side there, is good as well. Again, it will scale nicely depending on the size of the device, which kind of banners don't do. So that's how we work.
Great. So on the rewarded side, I think you hit a lot of the what, when, why, and how you balance it. What we are seeing as far as demand is concerned is one of our big kind of thesis going into rewarded on MoPub was we would be able to unlock ad diversity, we would be able to unlock brand spend. We've ramped up quite substantially in the first half of this year, and we're seeing a lot of that manifest itself, especially with substantial brand spend on rewarded video. So it's a healthcare ad or a vacation ad or a car ad instead of another app install ad, which helps with the consumer experience. How does that correlate with your experience as far as rewarded is concerned?
How does the consumer experience maintain?
Yeah.
Sorry. From rewarded ads itself?
Yeah. How do you drive diversity and how do you drive better engagement?
Okay, so rewarded ads are great in terms of maintaining the consumer experience. Like we said, you've got to start early with those. Some of the ways that we've done is we find that so I'll give you an example, WWE Tapmania. So within WWE Tapmania itself, there's a couple of different rewarded placements. The one which performs the best, where we see like an upwards of 70% engagement rate with that particular user, with the user base, is that you try and create a sense of rarity with it sometimes as well. So the ad is a golden suitcase where users are able to get a loot drop, and then we tie that into the progression within the game itself, so that as you progress further into the game, the more cash you're able to make from that particular placement itself. So that works really, really well. Like I said, that there's probably, if I step outside of Sega and I look at the industry as well, one of the best examples is what the Future Play guys are doing with Farm Away. So it was a fantastic kind of integration. They have a cloud where if you interact with a cloud, it waters your crops for 4 hours, and then the second game loop is they have a sun. You watch the sun, and then you're able to get a bonus, but the sun unlocks a mini game within the app itself. So really thinking about the consumer experience very, very early on. How do you surprise? How do you add value? How do you try and reduce some churn? The other thing we look to do as well is we look to try and cap the number of impressions, because if a consumer is just going to grind through continually, then how do you balance that particular placement? So we're looking at around kind of 6 roughly rewarded ad exposures within a day. So you need to kind of check and see what's right for yourself as far as you can. And then we find any more than that, then it's a good opportunity to push somebody across towards an in-app purchase if they're that much engaged. Great insight.
Great insight. So just to wrap up, I know we're out of time here, as you think about that 50 billion opportunity that's out there over the next 3 years, it's important to make sure that you're thinking about this early, thinking about this as a portfolio across everything that you're building.
Yeah.
Start thinking about the consumer experience right up front. Be intentional about how you're building that. And we've seen that introducing programmatic competition is a great way to drive up CPM, and especially for rewarded, in addition to driving up CPM, it also helps you diversify the ad experience and diversify the consumer experience. Those are the parting thoughts that I would leave all of you with. Anything you would like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Yeah, programmatic is an interesting thing. We're hugely excited about the opportunity that it represents. If I look at Sega Stack at the moment, we're pretty game-driven in terms of performance, and kind of brand has been a smaller part of that, even though it's been promised for a long time. We're trying some stuff on the viewability side, which should have an impact, I hope. But anything, you know, that basically opens up the play to brands is going to be hugely important. Yep. When I think about, as a final piece, Android, so we see a lot more downloads on Android organically than what we see on iOS, even though the monetization is higher. So if you're able to bring brands into space who maybe don't differentiate by platform as much as some of the performance marketeers, obviously they're still going to be interested in the devices itself. Then I think there's a huge revenue opportunity there. Mm-hmm. That and you know, thinking very early on about the data that you capture, because programmatic is going to become a big data play. So, but for us, if you're able to drive the top of your stack by working with some, you know, top kind of DSPs would be great, and eventually looking towards kind of what has been known as header bidding within desktop, maybe advanced bidding within mobile as well. I think it should open up some great revenue as it did in desktop for mobile.
Yeah, great perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anand.